Same sun, same planet, the same starting point 4.5 billion years ago. This continent built empires that spanned the globe, ran the world's financial system, and invented most of the technology you're using to watch this video right now. And this one has some of the richest natural resources on Earth: gold, diamonds, cobalt, oil, more arable land than almost anywhere else on the planet, and still struggles by almost every economic measure to develop the way Europe did. For a long time, the explanation people reached for was the worst possible one: something about the people themselves. Now, I want to be completely clear from the start. That explanation is wrong, and it's not what this video is about. The real explanation is colder and in some ways more interesting. It's about rivers, it's about coastlines, it's about geographic lottery that was decided millions of years before either continent had a name, flag, or a single human being standing on it. And later in this video, it's about what Europeans did once they discovered exactly how that lottery had played out. That's what we're figuring out today. Hi, I'm Rag, I'm a lawyer, an entrepreneur, and I'm very passionate about geopolitics. I once dreamed of becoming a diplomat, spent years studying international relations, geography, and the power games nations play. Life took me somewhere else, but the knowledge never left. If anything, it sharpened. And it completely changed how I see the world. So now when a headline drops or a debate breaks out at dinner, I'm not just reacting, I'm seeing the moves behind it. The history, the incentives, the reason it's happening now and not 10 years ago. That's what I want to give you, because the world isn't random. It's a strategy game being played out in real time. And I'm here to break down the board for you, one video at a time. Welcome to the Lore of Power. Let's play. Okay, let's start with the most basic thing about any continent: its edges. Europe is almost absurdly coastline. Look at it on a map. Peninsulas jutting out everywhere. The Mediterranean cutting deep into its southern half. Scandinavia carved up by the fjords, and islands scattered across nearly every sea around it. Despite being one of the smallest continents on Earth, Europe has more coastline relative to its size than almost anywhere else in the world. And Africa is the opposite. It's the second largest continent on the planet, with a landmass roughly 3 times the size of Europe's. But its coastline is remarkably smooth. It has few bays, fewer inlets, and some natural harbours for ships to shelter in. A continent 3 times the size, with a shorter actual coastline than the much smaller landmass next to it. See it this way. In Catan, the board game, the ports are what let you trade efficiently. Without one, you are stuck bartering inefficiently with whoever happens to be sitting next to you. Europe got handed a board covered in ports, and Africa got handed a board with almost none. And it's not just the coastline itself. For much of Africa, the land doesn't gently slope down to meet the sea the way it does across most of Europe. It drops sharply. Geographers call it the Great Escarpment. It's a steep wall of elevation change that runs along huge stretches of African coast, separating the shoreline from the interior plateau above it. So when explorers tried to push inland from the coast, they didn't just face a long walk. They faced cliffs. And that single fact, a steep drop right at the edge of the continent, made the simplest, oldest form of trade in human history dramatically harder to do here than almost anywhere else on Earth. Which brings us to the rivers, because this is where the story gets genuinely shocking. And it's the fact most people have never actually heard explained properly. The Congo River is the second most powerful river on earth by the volume of water it moves, behind only the Amazon. For thousands of miles inland, it's deep, wide, and entirely navigable. Large steamships have worked sections of it for over a century. But about 100 miles from the coast, the Congo hits something called the Livingstone Falls. 32 separate rapids and cataracts stretched across more than 200 miles, dropping nearly 1,000 feet in total elevation. It's so violent and unnavigable that engineers eventually had to build an entire railway line just to physically carry goods around it because there was no way to float them through. Think about what that actually means. One of the most powerful rivers on the planet, and the exact stretch where it should be doing its most important job, connecting the interior to the ocean and the rest of the world, is the one stretch where it simply can't be used at all. Remember the Mississippi system from our America episode? A free road network built by nature, carrying farmers' wheat all the way from the middle of the continent straight out to the ocean. The Congo should have been Africa's Mississippi. It has the size for it, it has the flow for it. It just doesn't have the final 100 miles for it. And the Congo isn't even the exception. The Nile has its own series of cataracts further south. The Zambezi has Victoria Falls. Nearly every major African river hits some kind of waterfall or rapid before reaching the sea. Why? Because much of the continent sits on a raised plateau that drops suddenly near the coast. The same great escarpment we talked about. And Europe's rivers, the Rhine, Danube, Seine, mostly do the opposite. They flow gently down from low hills straight into the sea, fully navigable practically their entire length. In Europe, a river was a highway. In Africa, for most of its history, a river was a highway with the last 100 miles permanently under construction. Here's a piece of this story that almost never makes it into the popular version. And it has nothing to do with rivers or coastlines at all. It's biological. There's an insect unique to Africa called the Tsetse fly. It carries a parasite that's relatively mild in humans but lethal to large domesticated animals, cattle, horses, oxen. Across a huge swath of the continent, for thousands of years, you simply could not reliably keep the animals that the rest of the world built entire economies around. Now think about what large domesticated animals actually do for a civilization. They pull plows, which means you can farm far more land with far less human labor. They carry heavy loads over long distances, which means you can move goods between regions. And they let you build large, settled, surplus generating agricultural states, which is more or less the founding economic engine behind every major civilization in Europe and Asia, from the wheat fields of Nile to river valleys of China. But in large parts of Africa, that engine was never available. In fact, economists who have studied this directly have found that historically, communities living in the Tsetse affected regions were significantly less likely to use domesticated animals or the plow. They were less likely to form large centralized states, and they had a lower population density. And crucially, this pattern doesn't show up in tropical regions outside Africa because the Tsetse fly doesn't exist outside Africa, anywhere else on earth. It's not the tropics that cause this. It's this one specific geographically confined insect that caused this. Now I want to be precise about what this argument is and isn't saying because it's easy to get this wrong. This isn't about the people who lived in these regions being less capable, less intelligent, or less ambitious than anyone else on earth. People adapted brilliantly to the conditions they were given. They had different farming methods, different settlement patterns, different economic and political structures suited to a landscape that simply didn't offer the same tools everyone else had. This is about which raw materials nature handed different parts of the world to build with. Europe and Asia were handed the ox and the plow. But a huge stretch of Africa was handed an insect that made the ox impossible to keep. This is not a verdict on anyone. It's a constraint. One more piece of the same lottery as the coastline and the rivers. I want to correct something here, including something I might have assumed myself before researching this properly. You'll often hear it said that the Sahara simply cut Africa off from the rest of the world. That's not true, and it undersells something genuinely impressive. For roughly 1,000 years, camel caravans regularly crossed the Sahara, carrying gold and salt between West Africa and the Mediterranean world. This trade built and financed some of the wealthiest empires in African history: Mali, Ghana, Songhai, and turned cities like Timbuktu into genuine centers of trade, scholarship, and literature, rivaling anything in Europe at the time. None of this is obscure history, it's very well documented. But here's the geographic point: crossing the Sahara required an enormous, specialized caravan operation. Hundreds or even thousands of camels, weeks of travel, and careful route planning around the oasis. Now compare that to a European merchant loading a single ship and sailing it down a navigable river. Both moved goods, but one was vastly cheaper, faster, and lower risk per unit of cargo than the other. So this isn't a story about isolation. It's a story about cost. The same lottery we have been tracing through coastlines, rivers, and disease ecology show up here too. Not as a wall that stopped people, but as friction that made every exchange more expensive than it had to be. So far, everything we have covered, the coastlines, the rivers, the disease ecology, the cost of crossing the Sahara, happened long before any European ship reached either continent's shore. That's the geographic lottery. Nobody chose it, nobody's fault, nobody's achievement. But starting in the late 1800s, something changed. Europe didn't just benefit from a better roll of dice. It actively organized the outcome of Africa's worst role into a system that made things harder on purpose. By the 1880s, European powers were all simultaneously trying to claim African territory. And it was getting chaotic. Rival claims were overlapping, disputes were breaking out between European nations over who owned what. And there was a real risk of European powers going to war with each other over African land. So in 1884, 14 European powers and the United States sent representatives to Berlin to formalize the rules for dividing up Africa. Not a single African representative was in the room. Basically, what the Berlin Conference did was that it gave European powers a shared legal framework, the principle of effective occupation, that let them claim African territory and have those claims recognized by each other, without any African government's consent required at any point in the process. It basically turned a chaotic land grab into an orderly one. And what followed from that framework is where the real damage lives. Over the next 3 decades, the borders that did get drawn, whether at Berlin or in the years after, routinely ignored existing kingdoms, existing languages, groups, and trade networks that had existed for centuries. The Somali people, for example, ended up split across 5 different colonial territories. Other borders forced historically rival groups into single colonies together. None of this was an accident of imprecise map making. It was a deliberate disregard for the political reality already on ground, because that reality was never the priority. Then there's the infrastructure, and this is the part that connects directly back to the geography problem we talked about earlier in the video. Where colonial governments did build roads and railways, they overwhelmingly built them for one purpose: getting resources out. A railway line from a copper mine to a port, a road from a cotton plantation to a coastal warehouse. Almost none of it was built to connect African cities and regions to each other. Remember the Congo's Livingstone Falls from earlier in the video? That railway built specifically to bypass those rapids. That's the perfect literal example of this pattern. That railway didn't connect Congolese communities to each other. It connected a mine in the interior to a ship waiting at the coast, built to solve Europe's transport problem, not Africa's. So, by the time most African nations gained independence in the mid 20th century, they inherited two compounding problems at once: the original geography, difficult coastlines, unnavigable rivers, disease ecology that limited large scale agriculture, and on top of that, decades of infrastructure and borders built specifically to extract value outward rather than to connect the continent inward. The lottery handed Africa a harder hand, but colonialism then organized that harder hand into a system that made it work for someone else. So let's total this all together. Because I don't think any single explanation we have covered today is the whole story on its own. Geography dealt Africa a genuinely harder hand than Europe. A smoother coastline with fewer natural ports, river systems blocked from the sea by their own waterfalls, a disease ecology that made the agricultural tools of the rest of the world far harder to use across the continent. None of that was anyone's fault. It's just physics, geology, and biology distributed unevenly across the planet. And it happened millions of years before anyone was around to complain about it. Then colonialism took that already harder hand and organized it into something worse. Borders that ignored the people living inside them, infrastructure built to extract value outward instead of connecting the continent inward, and decades of governance designed around someone else's interests rather than the people actually living there. But here's the part of the story that I think actually matters the most. And it's the part that gets left out because people seek single cause explanations. Since independence, different African countries that started with strikingly similar disadvantages have ended up in completely different places. Botswana is landlocked. It was one of the poorest countries on earth at independence in 1966. It had almost no infrastructure, no university, and inherited very little from its colonial period. By most accounts, it should have struggled exactly the way several of its neighbors did. Instead, it has become one of the fastest growing economies in the world for several decades running by doing something straightforward but rare: negotiating hard for a fair share of its own diamond wealth, investing that wealth into roads, schools, and public health instead of letting it disappear into a small circle of elites, and building institutions that mostly weren't corrupt. Meanwhile, several other African nations, despite having more natural resources than Botswana started with, are measurably poorer today than they were at the moment they became independent. So, the honest answer isn't Africa was destined by geography to struggle. And it isn't colonialism alone explains everything happening today either. It's three layers stacked on top of each other: a harder geographic starting position, a colonial period that organized that disadvantage into an extraction system, and then after independence, a set of human choices about governance that mattered enormously and that different countries made very differently. Europe got rich partly because of an extraordinary run of geographic luck. But luck alone has never been sufficient anywhere, including Europe. What separates the countries that turned a hard hand into real progress from the ones that didn't, again and again, comes down to what happens after the cards are dealt. So let's total the score on this one. Firstly, a coastline lottery that handed Europe natural harbours on every side, while giving Africa a smooth, fortress like edge that's 3 times the size but barely has anywhere for a ship to shelter. Second, a river lottery that gave Europe highways flowing gently to the sea, while Africa's most powerful river, one of the largest on earth, hits an impassable wall of rapids in the exact 100 miles where it matters the most. Third, a biological lottery, invisible and almost never discussed, that took the ox and the plough off the table across huge parts of the continent for thousands of years. for reasons that had nothing to do with the people living there and everything to do with one insect that exists nowhere else on the planet. And then, layered on top of all of it, a colonial period that took every one of those natural disadvantages and organized them into a system. Borders that ignored the people living inside them, and railways built to extract value outward, not connect a continent inward. Europe didn't get rich because it deserved it more. It got rich because it won a geographic lottery it never had to enter, and then built on that advantage for centuries without the same obstacles in its way. And Africa didn't stay poor because of anything about its people. It started with a harder hand, had that hand actively organized against it for a better part of a century, and is now writing widely different chapters depending on what each individual country has chosen to do since. Geography dealt the cards, history stacked the deck further, and what happens next is still genuinely an open question, being answered differently in Gaborone than in places that haven't yet found their own version of what Botswana found. There's one more thing I want to leave you with: a stretch of water smaller than the Mediterranean, $5 trillion in trade passing through it every single year, and almost every major power on earth claiming a piece of it while insisting publicly that none of it is really about control. It's not about the fish. That's next. If this changed how you see the headlines, like and subscribe to The Lore of Power. See you there.